Welcome to the 91st Street Y. Apparently the 92nd Street Y is expanding. I did not know of its imperialist aspirations. My understanding is the room that was booked at the traditional location was not big enough to accommodate all the people who wanted to hear about Joyce's book. Hello up there. There's a second theory, and that is that this house of worship, known as Redeemer East Side, given its name, is not a place that we would be worried about finding Donald Trump. For that, more likely to see him at the Church of Vindictive Prosecution, which is on the west side. So it's good to be here. I just have a couple of things I want to say at the outset, and then we'll bring out Joyce. Lots of things going on in the news, among them the No Kings rallies. Did anybody go to that? Yeah? So we're agreed on that, no kings, we're against kings. I wasn't able to go. My family and I had a family wedding to the north in Canada. We made it back and forth safely. All our papers were in order. But I did see, some people sent me pictures of the signs. You had nice signs? Do you have any favorite signs? So one of my favorite signs that someone told me about was the person who held up one placard that said, "Stephen Miller puts mayo on pastrami." This is definitely a 91st Street Y crowd for that joke to hit so well. My personal favorite was, there's a picture of I think like a 9-year-old boy who had a sign, not very fancy, on which he had written, "Trump hit on my girlfriend." This is why I believe that children are our future. I suppose some people are from out of town. How many folks are here in the great city of New York and vote in the great city of New York? So I don't know if you know, there's an election coming up. You must vote. That's the law. So I have an understanding of like what kind of crowd I'm dealing with and adjust accordingly when I ask questions of my friend Joyce. How many folks here want Curtis Sliwa to be the next mayor? How many people here want Zohran Mamdani to be the next mayor? How many people want Andrew Cuomo to be the next mayor? And how many people want that 9-year-old kid who wrote that sign? You don't have to be old enough to vote to be the mayor, I don't think. There's a lot of other stuff going on. I began the day today, like I do every Tuesday morning, with Joyce. We have a podcast that we do. She has a couple, I have a couple. So I get to begin the day and end the day with Joyce today, which is a great treat. For those of you who are here, the Cafe Insider podcast, I think, has posted, or will post soon. We talked about the Jim Comey motions. We talked about the John Bolton prosecution. And let me just say, before we get started, on a serious note, how important the defense of the rule of law is. Joyce and I will be talking about that in the abstract, and also, I think, in the particular. I can't say anything more than the following. David French, who now writes for the New York Times, was quoted recently as saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, that in recent weeks, one of the reasons he misses the practice of law is that it would be really great and really meaningful, in his words, to be at one of the most important posts for the defense of the rule of law in the country, which would be to have a role on Jim Comey's defense team. I don't have that particular role, but I feel the same way, because it is a great honor of my professional and legal life to represent Senator Adam Schiff in the Vindictive prosecution that is unfolding there, and on that, stay tuned. Without further ado, Joyce Vance is my friend, my former colleague, my current colleague, my podcast co-host. We were sworn in on the same day, confirmed by the United States Senate, how quaint is that to be confirmed by the United States Senate? Back in 2009, in August. And it's been a great delight and pleasure and honor and treat and all sorts of other synonyms you can come up with for me to spend time with her and learn from her. And I hope to further that conversation discussion today. She has written a great book, an important book, Giving Up Is Unforgivable. We'll talk about the title and what she means by a manual for keeping our democracy. Joyce Vance, podcast host, former U.S. attorney, raiser of chickens, knitter of scarves, explainer of laws, soon to be the next New York Times bestselling author, Joyce Vance.
You are so sweet.
Hi, Joyce.
Hi, that's, I think, the nicest grouping of things you've ever said about me.
I only got a few of the things.
Well, I appreciated it.
So we're gonna talk about your book in a second. We've been friends a long time. We've been colleagues a long time. So I thought I would start with a non-softball question so people would understand that, you know, I'll ask tough questions even of a friend.
You've never asked me a softball question.
And since I'm not getting paid for this, I might as well ask you as tough a question as possible. So the question is, as I mentioned in the intro, we were literally in the group of first U.S. attorneys in the country under Barack Obama. And novice, new U.S. attorneys. And my question to you is, if you could estimate how much of an obstacle it was for you, how much of a challenge it was for you when you began as U.S. attorney in Alabama to have virtually zero experience in insurance law.
You know,
I mean, how did you know?
It was a challenge.
How did you know how to indict in the grand jury? Like, how did you know?
I mean, it meant that I actually was very familiar with going in and indicting cases in the grand jury, but I knew nothing about insurance. What's a girl to do?
This is such an inside baseball crowd that in no other place would that joke have been understood. Let's get to your book.
But let me just say, though, before we leave that, not only were we Senate confirmed, Jeff Sessions called me the minute we were confirmed to personally let me know. It was important to him to make sure that I knew that he had given me his support, which is to speak of what a different era we live in now.
Yeah. I mean, who is that you speak of? Look, that's another piece of evidence that no matter how loyal you are to the current President of the United States and then President of the United States, if you cross him on one thing, in fact, Jeff Sessions is probably lucky, given what we're dealing with and facing and have been talking about, that he got off just being jobless. Anyway, giving up is unforgivable. I gave you some grief this morning on the podcast saying, you know, how'd you come up with the title? What was in your mind? Giving up is not easy. Giving up is less favored. How'd you come up with the second part of the title? Why is it unforgivable, and what does giving up mean?
You know, and I told you this morning, I kept wanting to say, you know, we can't give up. Giving up would be bad. Giving up would be wrong. But it was clear that it was more than that, right? It was unforgivable. And Joe Biden at one point actually said those words after the election, and he made the point that losing elections is not the end of the world, that he too had lost elections, and that giving up is unforgivable. I thought that was the perfect capture for where we were in a moment where we were all exhausted.
We're in a congregation of people who have obviously not given up because they're here. I guess my first question is, giving up on what? What is the thing that we're talking about that's implicit in not giving up?
So for me, that's not giving up on democracy, on our form of government. What I sensed after the election was people who thought that democracy had failed. because Democrats lost an incredibly important election that I think deep down none of us believed we would lose, right? We were worried, but it seemed that given the choices Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, it really felt like a no-brainer. Even living in Alabama, I will tell you that it felt like a no-brainer. So it's democracy, but it's also the rule of law, which I view in many ways as sort of the architecture that democratic institutions live on top of. This notion that no man is above the law, that we're a government of laws, not of men. And I heard so many people saying, well, it's failed, it's broken, Donald Trump broke it. I wrote the book because I don't believe that's true.
It seems to me that also a first step that precedes giving up is turning away, right? So the thing that we talk about, so we do this podcast together, and then we each have another podcast. Mine is called Stay Tuned, which is kind of apropos of this sentiment, which is the tagline I use at the end of the podcast now is that there's never been a more important time to stay tuned. The first thing it strikes me in my experiences talking to people, talking to audiences like this one, talking to you, is that people don't just sort of hang up their hat at the first whiff of some bad thing happening. They turn away because the news is too much to bear. They don't want to hear about the bad stuff. It comes fast and furious. It floods the zone, whether that's by design or by happenstance. And the first step on the road to surrender or giving up is not wanting to hear the bad stuff. What's your advice and prescription to allay that problem in the first place?
This is a difficult problem that many of us have struggled with, and I think even more so is how do you react to friends who tell you, oh, it's just too much, I just have to unplug from the news, I can't pay attention any longer. I find myself responding, and look, I mean, I try to be patient because we're all human beings struggling under an incredible burden right now. But I think it's incumbent upon us to patiently explain that the more overwhelmed you feel, the more important it is to at least carve out something that you can pay attention to. If you're in public health, pay attention to public health. If you're a lawyer, pay attention to whatever court cases interest you. Some days, so much happens in court that I simply can't keep up with everything all at once. But my good friend Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's here in New York, who writes about strongmen and dictators, says that this flooding of the zone, that this is a deliberate tactic that authoritarians try to use to persuade people to turn away from paying attention. And of course, it's far easier to become a dictator if nobody's watching what you're doing. And so I think armed with that knowledge, that sense that this is something deliberate that's being done to us, I think that empowers us to stay tuned, which is why I love the new tagline, this notion that it's never been more important.
Yeah, I mean, further to what you're saying, it seems to me that your exhaustion is their victory before your surrender is their victory, because your exhaustion leads to surrender. So do you recommend doing, having hobbies?
Well, let me tell you about chickens.
Because you do a lot of stuff. You do a lot of stuff.
In the great experience that one derives being a parent of 4 children, maybe 5 if you count my husband, and I do, it is so important to keep balance. And I think instinctively that's something that we're all struggling for right now. What it comes down to for me is this. If they make you miserable, if you are so focused on what Donald Trump is doing to our country that you have no more joy in your life, then I think in a sense they do begin to win. And so for me at least, I found it more important to deliberately make time to be with friends, to do the things I love, including hang out with my chickens in the morning. They have big personalities. And I'm reminded of something that Tim Snyder said. So I teach a class on democratic institutions at the University of Alabama. We had the opportunity to sit in on a talk that Tim Snyder, who wrote on tyranny, who I think everybody knows, to sit in on a talk that he gave. And at the end, somebody asked him, what's the most important thing we can be doing right now to push back? And he said, hug the people around you. And it was very surprising. You know, he's such a cerebral, scholarly kind of guy. And hearing him say that, I thought was transformative, this notion that it's our humanity that matters the most, and that in a moment like this, we should make time for our hobbies, or to have dinner with friends, or to make sourdough bread. You know, whatever it is that keeps you on an even keel, that's worth doing, because it will prevent you from burning out and forcing yourself to tune out just to stay on a keel.
Yeah, no, I often say, for me and you, in a similar way, we can't tune out. That's how I make my living in all the various jobs that I have.
Have you had that experience of going on vacation and unplugging for a couple of days?
I try.
It's hard.
But then people email and text me all the bad stuff
me?
that's happened, like you. And then sometimes I've written pieces while on vacation. I went with my family to India, and I tried to tune out, and that's when this whole conflagration arose about immigration and H-1B visas, and I literally couldn't help myself and had to pay attention, even though it was 9.5 hours ahead in the time zone. So what should people listen to? How should they figure out that, other than listening to our podcasts, available also on YouTube?
It's my favorite.
But how should people, to the extent somebody has a diet of news, and obviously everyone is here because they care about the country, they care about being educated, they don't want to turn away, and they certainly don't want to give up. But do you have any thoughts, and you have some passing references to this in the book, when you're listening to the news, when you're watching the news, how do you interpret it? What filter should you use? What lens, prism do you use? Should you, dare I say it, at the expense of heart failure and other maladies, listen to what the folks who you don't agree with are hearing and understand what their lens and prism are also? And if so, how much?
So y'all don't take this wrong, but I'm a big believer in sleeping with the enemy, which is to say that I watch Fox News and I watch some of the further right news channels, and I listen to people who I know I don't agree with, even when I know it's going to make my blood boil. For one thing, I want to make sure that I'm correct when I disagree with them. I want to make sure that there's not some kernel of truth in what they're saying that I need to ponder. I think that's just fair. But more importantly, I like to understand the arguments that are being made, the arguments that have persuaded so many Americans that what's not true is true. I don't think we can have conversations with people unless we understand what they're hearing. You know, in Finland, and I write about this in the book, they have this remarkable disinformation program that begins with school kids, elementary school kids. And they are taught, not sort of as a separate topic, but in the context of every classroom subject with their teachers, how to evaluate information that they're taking in. They're taught to look at who the author is, what possible bias they might have, what points are they making, and to think critically about information before they accept it. And one thing that has stuck with me is a teacher who said, I want them to understand that just because something makes them feel good, or it's pretty, or it's an attractive idea, that doesn't necessarily make it true. And they have to be critical of it. And I reflect on the fact that we do not do anything to arm our children, our young people in this country against disinformation and misinformation. We have not caught up with the internet and the reality of modern life. That's a whole of community exercise that we need to take on.
By the way, we're going to go for another 30 minutes. There's a Q&A period. I think someone is walking around with cards. So in good penmanship, put your questions.
He is so demanding. He's like this.
I can't read bad pen. I can't read my own notes. So I have no idea what I'm going to. No, I do. What time of day do you suggest for people that they should watch Fox News?
This is a difficult question.
Is it before or after happy hour?
I think it's after happy hour, and so the primetime shows are your best bet.
What if your happy hour is 8 a.m.? Then you can watch the...
Are you talking about yourself?
No, I'm not. Not today. Not today.
I had a law school roommate who used to say it's always after 5 p.m. someplace.
So I have sort of a rule of thumb on whether I listen to someone, pay attention to them, digest them, whether they're on our side, whatever that means, or someone else's side. And that is if I can always, every single time, predict exactly what they're going to say, what side of the issue they're going to be on, then I tune them out. Do you agree with that? And are there other examples of that?
5 years ago, I would have agreed with that about 1,000%. Because frankly, we can all be knee-jerk in our own minds, right? We don't need somebody else to do that for us. The problem that we now face, though, is increasingly those lines are drawn in a very different way. There is a wrong and there is a right. Very often in the law, and we do this in the podcast a lot, right? There are good arguments on both sides of an issue. And in fact, that's why cases go to judges, because people aren't able to resolve them on their own. And so we have judges who make decisions in those close call sorts of cases. I think in some sense, we now live in a world where there's no longer that sort of both sidesism. But that's the rare situation. I don't want to make that sound like that's the entire world. That is some of the world. I think about that a lot. I don't like that thought. I find it to be very disturbing. For instance, that I can listen to the President of the United States and know that he's lying and that there aren't two sides to it. Leaving that aside, my favorite people to listen to are people that I don't agree with. And I think that's why I enjoy reading opinion pieces that other legal scholars have written. It's something that I think you do really well. You are very unpredictable. I can't always tell where you're going to be on an issue.
I feel a lot of pressure to ask a totally unpredictable question. Look, I'll tell you, folks, I quoted him at the beginning. David French, who used to write for the National Review Online, Andy McCarthy, who was my chief, my supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, writes for the NRO. And so just as an example of a genre of writing, some people will call them never-Trumpers, but I think of them as people who I ideologically don't agree with on a lot of stuff. Tax policy, education policy, a whole bunch of things. But on core things, I think the things that you care about here in this book, and that you talk about every week, week in and week out, on the podcast and on television, what does the Constitution mean? Not with respect to a particular school of thought or doctrine, but overall, do we care about a nation of separated powers or not? Do we care about our overweening and overarching executive or not? I find it interesting to hear from people who I don't agree with on lots and lots of political issues and hear how they talk about critiques of the MAGA universe, because those critiques are different from the ones that I and my friends engage in and that you and I engage in.
That, I think, is an interesting point, right? This notion that we live in a moment where reasonable people will support country over party, including people who were hard-right, ideological Republicans for much of their adult life, but who are willing to come back to the center in some sense to talk about the importance of democracy first. Something that really puzzles me is how so many folks who, when I was in law school, were strong states' rights sort of conservatives, this notion that the federal government shouldn't intervene in affairs that the Constitution left to the states, and how quickly that seems to have faded away. You don't really hear that from some of these old-line senators anymore. And so I appreciate voices, especially lawyers, who are willing to continue to raise those arguments for all of us to consider. And of course, that's the value in listening to people that you don't agree with on everything. They remind you of principle. They remind you of what matters. They encourage you to believe that we don't have to see eye to eye on every substantive issue in order to believe that this country should remain a democracy. So look, I very much look forward to getting back to squabbling over politics with my law school roommate, a Tea Party conservative in Mississippi. For now, we're on the same side of the equation, I fear.
How do you feel about what seems to be becoming truer and truer as the sides align against each other and don't find common ground? And that is, and this is anathema to people in our profession, right, the legal profession, because that's all about process. Right, the Constitution does not guarantee any outcomes at all. It guarantees a process. In fact, process is the most important word in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't have the word democracy in it, I don't believe. But process, often modified by the word due process, substantive or procedural, is the essence of what America is all about. And to the extent you have thought about this and are giving a prescription about the unforgivability of giving up, how much is that of the problem arises from the fact that people have given up on process? They want what they want the outcome, they want their political opponent to be locked up. By the way, this whole business of locking up your opponent, I believe, began in modern times with the chance of lock her up, Hillary Clinton, back in 2015 and 2016. And now they're actually getting locked up. There is a view on the other side also, I don't mean to both sides it, but a lot of people think, I want the thing that I want, and whatever process gets me that thing is fine by me. How much of that is the problem?
I mean, I think you've just identified the defining principle of MAGA. I feel like life has dealt me some unfair blows. I want what I want. Here's how I get it. Constitution be damned. What did you say this morning? The frickin' Constitution?
I didn't mean to say frickin' Constitution.
But I mean, you were...
Our great charter.
You were saying it in the sense of that's how, you know, folks just inexplicably view the Constitution and the rule of law as something that gets in their way, not as something that guarantees their way of life. And that's what we've lost so much of in this country, this understanding that due process, which, yes, it protects people who don't have legal immigration status in this country, but without due process, none of us are protected either, right? And I think that's very much the key point that has slipped away. We are no longer a country where there's civics education that takes place at a sophisticated level. In many of our schools, you don't see that happening anymore. But you know what always reassures me is, so I'll get law students from LA, Lower Alabama. And I just have to tell you, if you ever think that you're losing hope in the future of our country, then you need to sit in a room full of University of Alabama law students, because these are some of the smartest, brightest, most committed kids, regardless of their politics. They believe in principle and they believe in giving back to their community. And every year in my democratic institutions seminar, I'll have a student who will say something to the effect of, I took 4th grade civics and I was hooked. And this notion that, you know, grade school teachers, who I think are America's unsung heroes, my mom was a preschool teacher, that they're able to engage people at an early age and help them understand how important democracy and voting is. We need more of that, but we can't let it be the provenance of schools alone. I think that this sort of ongoing exercise in civics education and the value of democracy has to be something that we talk about with our kids, with our families, when we're sitting in our house, when we're out on walks. It needs to be something that, instead of being thought about in the breach, is integrated into how we live, because we are in a moment where people took democracy for granted for so long that when someone came along who wanted to erode it around the edges, there wasn't a strong push, right? So many people had been able to take for granted the process that the Constitution guarantees them, that it did not occur to them what they might possibly be giving up. So many Americans now understand that. 7 or 8 million people who went out and protested last weekend. And I think it came as a shock to a lot of political analysts and political consultants who always tell their candidates, it's the economy, run on the economy, not on democracy. And all of a sudden we have Americans holding signs that say due process, walking down streets, numbering in the millions of people. That's a moment in this country, and it's a shift that we need to nurture and encourage and further. So whether we're reading more serious books about democracy in our book clubs or talking about it at family gatherings, I think Thanksgiving is going to be lit for a bunch of families this year. That's something that we can all do.
Do you watch Fox News together with your family?
My husband watches no news, but he is the king of YouTube. I hope he's listening.
This point you just mentioned, I think, is a critically important one, because political consultants, take a step back. It's great for us to talk and educate, but power is power, and people who are in positions of power actually wield power. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of power, we the people, I believe in it, but Today, the people who are in positions of power are able to shut down the government or unshut down the government. They're able to affect medical treatment, all sorts of things that are true. And Democratic political operatives will say, just as you alluded to, talk about the economy, it's the economy, stupid. Issues of democracy, and when you talk about fascism and the rule of law, that's hard to understand. It's abstract, it's not concrete. What do you say? Do you agree that politicians should do their job and talk about so-called kitchen table issues, and people like us, who are lawyers by practice, should be the only ones spreading the alarm on this? Or do you think that they're both intertwined in a way that you can't separate them?
I am so weary of the suggestion that Americans aren't smart enough to understand the value of democracy. If you live in a moment like this one, and politicians are afraid to talk about the value of democracy, then my head just is going to explode. I think it's possible that Americans are willing to talk about both things at once, that we can see the value of democracy and the economy, and maybe we can even see the connection between them if our politicians are willing to trust us as much as they ask us to trust them. This isn't a hard question, and I'll tell you from personal experience, when Doug Jones, my former boss, ran and won the Senate race in Alabama, he won that race for a couple of reasons. One was that his opponent was a no-good pedophile.
That always helps.
But maybe not as much as you might think in Alabama. Doug did something, and look, I'm a fan. Doug did something that I have so much respect for. In one of the first interviews he did on national television, he was asked about abortion, an absolutely toxic issue in Alabama. And he said, "I believe in a woman's right to choose." And I was driving, I sort of slammed my head down on my front of my car, and I was like, "Doug, don't, of course that's what you think. Don't come out and say it." And we talked about it afterwards, and I was like, could you not have used politician buzzwords and said that, but said it more softly? And he said, no, I couldn't. That's what I believe in. I believe that a woman has a right to choose, including a late-term abortion. I'm not going to walk away from that. I'm going to die on that hill. And so this centrist, moderate Democrat was willing to run on principle, was willing to talk in Alabama about democracy and why it mattered so much. And he won that race, an impossible race based on the polling numbers early on. And he won that race because people understood that he was authentic and that he would be honest with them and that they might not agree with everything that he thought or believed, but that he would always listen to them and try to act in their best interests. I'm going to regret saying all of this because Doug is going to absolutely hear this and make me eat it for having said nice things about him. But isn't this what we want? Don't we want politicians who care about the issues that matter to us? And doesn't democracy matter to all of us right now?
Yeah, look, Doug Jones no longer has his power, his seat, I should say. He has his integrity, right? And I think that we need more people who care about their integrity than they care about their seat and power. And it's really astonishing how much people want to hold on to power, including in our former stomping grounds. If you actually started, I was thinking about this the other day, I think we've joked about it, although it's not funny. If you created a law firm of the forced out or fired assistant U.S. attorneys and U.S. attorneys, you would have maybe the most formidable law firm in the country.
It'd be extraordinary.
I'm going to start calling them up and start organizing. So before we get to solutions and what everyone can do, I want to identify prioritize the problems. Mm-hmm. Non-exhaustive list, what should we be most worried about? Is it the calling out of the National Guard over the objection of governors in various states? Is it the campaign of political retribution? Is it the gutting of the CDC? Is it bombing ships where you do or you may not know whether or not there's drug activity going on? Is it the disappearing of people by officials in ICE who are wearing masks? I can go on and on and on. Ranked choice voting, how do you put those?
So it's the common thread that runs among all of them. It's the central tenet of Trumpism in his second administration, which is accumulating all the power that the people have delegated to government in the hands of the president and upsetting the balance of power that the founding fathers set. You know, this very basic notion that we all get of 3 branches of government, so no one gets too powerful, no one can override the rule of the people. And here we have a president egged on by the unitary executive theorists who believe in a powerful presidency. Donald Trump believes in an all-powerful presidency, a president who can, for instance, on the basis of no evidence, designate strike targets, lethal strike targets in foreign waters, a president who believes that he has the power to federalize National Guard troops and take them into cities which just coincidentally happen to be led by Democrats. Most recently talking about Portland being in flames over the weekend, which I am assured by friends in Portland is not the case, and I think we've seen plenty of pictures that suggest to us that there are far more blow-up unicorns in Portland than there are flames, right? I mean, this notion that a president can shamelessly lie in an executive order and justify putting troops on the streets in an American city for God knows what purpose, although some people like J.B. Pritzker have speculated it might have something to do with upcoming elections, this notion that he will lie in order to obtain more power and that he will now ask the Supreme Court to sign off on that exercise of power. This is the challenge that we face in this moment. How do we keep that from happening with what our friend Dahlia Lithwick likes to call a supine Congress, right? Congress is like my German Shepherd when she rolls over and just shows you her belly, and that's all the oomph that she has.
But your German Shepherd is cute.
She is. She's so much more adorable than they are. And you know, the courts, I mean, look, I venerate the work that lower court judges are doing in this era of trying to uphold their oaths. I have maybe a few more questions about the Supreme Court. I would like to believe that having given Trump just absolute immunity from criminal conduct, that perhaps they will set some civil limits and find that presidents don't have the authority to do whatever they want to do on any given day. But we have to be candid about that and say that the verdict is still out on that, and we will know when we know.
Okay, so let's talk about the solution here. And I want to give you some gentle pushback on one of the articulations you have in here.
Oh, good. Sure.
So I was with you, and then you talk about hopelessness, and you write, hopelessness is where autocrats try to push you so that you'll stop opposing them. The answer, and I'm looking, okay, what's the answer? Very excited.
You don't like my answer?
Well, I'm going to tell you what I think. Your answer, be like Dr. King, be like John Lewis. I'm like, I can't even be like the guy I was yesterday. That's a tall order. What did you mean by that?
So there are so many examples from our history, and I talk about a lot of them in the book. And John Lewis, if he was with us today, he would push back when you said that you couldn't be like him. Because John Lewis understood that we were human and that we were frail and that we could only do what we could do on any given day. But that if each of us summoned whatever, gumption we had to push back when it was our moment to push back, that all of us doing that in unison could make progress. And look, I will just say, I didn't know John Lewis very well. He and my father-in-law knew each other in the civil rights area and cooked up a little bit of good trouble together. That's what I always look to think about this moment. Because, if you were a black person in the Deep South in the 50s and the 60s, the possibility that you would be able to vote, that seemed pretty remote. This was an era when black people who were trying to register to vote were told that they had to pass a literacy test to show that they were smart enough to vote. Here's this big jar of jelly beans. Tell me how many jelly beans are in the jar, and if you don't get it right, you can't register. That is a true story that John Lewis used to tell about Dallas County, Alabama, which is where Selma is. I think John Lewis's lesson and the lesson of other folks who have lived through times where they were not given the opportunity to be full participants in this country's political system, even though they were citizens, the lesson is do what you can in the moment. And do it, by the way, in community. Don't think that you have to do it alone. Don't think that you personally are responsible for fighting the entire battle. Find people that you love and who make you happy and who will let you help them help democracy survive. And trust that if we all work together, and look, you might want to be a poll watcher, you might want to be an election worker, you might want to be a teacher, you might want to be involved in civics work in your community. In many ways, the most important thing is you pick what you are passionate about, and you just get started without worrying that you're not enough. Because that's what I hear you saying. I can't do it. I'm not sure that I can do it. I mean, you know that
I didn't
every
really
day
mean
you're
it.
doing it. I know you
was-
didn't. But I sense for a lot of people, there's that real worry that they shouldn't do anything because whatever they do won't be significant enough. I want to reassure people. It will be. Whatever you're doing, it's the right thing.
Yeah, we the people. You know, it reminds me of my favorite quote that I haven't heard in a while on the ability of people to do things. I think it's attributed to Archimedes, who once said, give me a long enough lever and a place to stand and I shall move the earth itself, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we should aspire to those things.
We have a long lever, right? We the people.
Just not a place to stand at the moment. So you have a whole list of things that we can do and we should do. Because you say, we are the cavalry. By we, I mean you, even you guys up there. And the guidelines include a series of proposals. The first one, be smart. I like that one.
You are.
Okay, thank you. Tell us about the guidelines.
So I start from the premise that we should not sit around and wait for somebody else to come and fix democracy for us, right? No one is going to swoop in and do that. It really is our shared responsibility. And if we're going to do that, we need to prepare for it as though we were going to run a marathon. Because between now and November of 2026 and probably November of 2028, we are all running a marathon together, and we need to train to do that. So I think we have to do a number of things that I lay out in the book. Being smart is one of them. Understanding what we can accomplish together, I think, is critical. Working in community is incredibly important. Learning how to filter out misinformation and disinformation. Because if you are the person who has never fallen for misinformation, then God bless you. I try so hard not to, but occasionally I will see something online and I will believe it only to realize a couple of hours or days later that it's not true. And so I'm trying to constantly evolve how good of a job I'm able to do to understand what the truth is. But perhaps my favorite thing on the list, and something that I think really matters, is to recognize that not everyone will want to fight for democracy in the same way. Some people will do it through the arts. I have some knitting friends who love to knit these fabulous pieces with political slogans on them. And that can really galvanize a whole community of people who may not be, reached by Preet and me talking about the law on Tuesday mornings, although I can't imagine anyone who wouldn't be reached by that. But I think the important point is to expand our definition of who stands with us in community, in favor of democracy, and to support people wherever they live on that spectrum so that there is room for all of us.
Do we have questions coming from the audience? If someone wants to hand cards up in a few minutes, we'll turn to those. I do want to spend a couple of minutes, since we do this every week on Tuesday mornings, and this is a very educated group, and it's relevant to all the things you talk about in your book. Some current events, shall we? I mentioned one in the opening, and maybe we'll get some questions on this, and we're anticipating it. But we did read with great enthusiasm and interest 2 motions filed by the lawyers for Jim Comey, who was also our former colleague, used to be my boss at one point, filed by his principal lawyer, Pat Fitzgerald, another former colleague of ours. What'd you make of the vindictive and selective prosecution argument?
You know, I can remember another moment in American legal history where Pat Fitzgerald, Jim Comey's lawyer, former U.S. attorney in Chicago, reminded the country that the rule of law still worked. And that was this moment at the end of the Bush administration when a series of U.S. attorneys had been fired for what you were involved in, exposing as political reasons. And there were some serious questions about the integrity of the Justice Department. And then Pat Fitzgerald indicts the governor in Illinois, Rod Blagojevich, and stands up on national television and just in this wonderfully earnest manner, and I didn't know Pat from a hole in the wall at this point, and explains on national television the search warrant, the indictment, and does something that we at the Justice Department really don't do nearly often enough, because we can't talk about the substance of our cases beyond the four walls of the document, right? What's in the indictment, what's in the affidavit with the warrant. He talked about the process and explained what they had done and why they had done it. It was unbelievably reassuring, at least to me in my office. I watched it with my best friend, who was also a prosecutor in my office at that time. We were both assistant United States attorneys, and we felt so much pride that there was someone who was willing to explain to people what the Justice Department was doing and why it mattered, while respecting the defendant's rights and being clear in saying that he was innocent until he was proven guilty. And so now we have these two motions that Fitzgerald and Jim Comey's other lawyers have filed in the Comey prosecution. And they make, I think, what will frankly be a turning point in the way that we perceive this Trump administration, arguing in plain-spoken language against the use of the powers of the presidency to indict, to charge in a criminal case an enemy, someone who, but for the whims of the president, the desire of a president to get revenge, would not be charged in a case where there may not even be criminal conduct, quite frankly. And if there is, it's just so marginal that no right-thinking federal prosecutor would ever think to bring the case. In fact, we know that federal prosecutors left their jobs rather than bring this case. So we don't need to speculate. There's actually proof that no right-thinking prosecutor, and to come full circle, this is why you need the experience of being an insurance lawyer to be a U.S. attorney.
I bet you know a lot about insurance law too, Joyce. You're being modest.
Not a thing.
Do you want to say anything about the John Bolton prosecution before we go to audience questions? And there are lots of good ones here.
You know, I'm curious, have y'all been following the Bolton case like we've been? I hear people saying two different things. I hear many people saying the Bolton indictment looks much more like a typical prosecution we would see out of the Justice Department, 20 pages of factual basis underlying the 18 counts that he is charged with. And then I hear people saying, we can't trust this Justice Department. This is a Justice Department that has gone into court and told judges things that are not true. This is an ideological Justice Department. I will tell you that that second view of the case fills me with so much sadness, perhaps because even though that's not where I ultimately land on this one, I don't think that we can immediately discredit that. I do think we have to be critical and wait to see what the evidence is. But I'm used to living in a world where if career federal prosecutors, and these are the people who indicted John Bolton, are willing to lay out 20 pages worth of what their evidence is to support the charges they are bringing, they are doing that because they have that evidence and they believe that they can put it forward. And so we will see John Bolton's lawyers file motions, again for selective and vindictive prosecution, right? But for the president's animus, he wouldn't be charged. And you know, we do live in a strange world where the Secretary of War can get on Signal and disclose important information while American military pilots are still in the air, in essence endangering their lives by putting that in a public means of communication. And what does the Attorney General of the United States say? Nothing to look at here, not going to even open an investigation. So we have these two parallel legal systems going on right now. That is something that'll have to be addressed. It may not mean that John Bolton gets his case dismissed. It will be an issue in this case throughout.
Yeah. So some great questions here, and congratulations on all of you for your penmanship. I can read all of them. So I love this question.
He is always like this, y'all, every week.
Let's see if you understand what's going on in this question. Let me knit two related questions together.
Oh, I like this person.
There are no initials. One, does Trump always chicken out? Two, is this phrase insulting to your chickens?
You know, I occasionally treat my chickens with fancy attire. And I will confess, I saw someplace a picture of a chicken in a taco costume. And I went to a lot of trouble. I tracked down a taco costume. I tried to get my chickens to wear it. And one of our chickens, Pickles, who's maybe our chicken with the most personality, she was delighted to let me put the costume on her. It's sort of like hooked underneath her little belly. And you could see the taco on top, sort of reminiscent of a ballerina in, the Nutcracker. And she went zooming around the yard, and I happened to get a really good picture of her, which I think still lives on Instagram. So to answer the question, no, my chickens are not offended, but they are more than willing to partake in the enjoyment of making fun of this president.
This is a more serious question and a great question. It's about the Supreme Court, and it's a really good question, fundamental one.
These are the hard ones.
I understand why Congress is so beholden to and afraid of Trump. But why the Supreme Court? Their appointments are lifelong. Is the problem that they are just ideologues and not acting in the best interests of the country? Or is there a pressure point on a personal level?
This is a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I obviously don't, but I'm not above speculating.
Yeah, please.
Right? I mean, I do think that there is some truth to the view that there's ideology at work here. And there was certainly a long-term push to get people on the court who would, for instance, be proponents of the unitary executive theory and believe that the executive branch, not out of bad motives, right? Who would believe doctrinally that the presidency had been stripped of too much of its power by Congress and the courts. And they viewed, I think, unitary executive as an effort to right-size that policy. Where it seems to me that the disconnect comes into play is that no one anticipated that this conservative remolding of the court would happen on the same track with a president who was absolutely willing to abuse power. That, it seems to me, is the problem that we face, that this Supreme Court has been very slow to understand that there's a real-world impact to the decisions that they're making. It's not a matter of setting up a new conservative paradigm that the country can move forward under, but that they have so overbalanced the presidency that they have thrown that continued forward movement into question. They're going to get an opportunity this term to show us where they stand on these issues. I think it's going to be the most important term ever to watch the Supreme Court carefully and closely.
This question goes to one of your areas of expertise, not including insurance law, but voting rights and the polls.
We do a lot of that in Alabama.
It's raised an interesting and frightening specter. What can we do if this administration sends troops to the polls at the midterms to intimidate voters who are Dems or non-MAGA?
There are people who believe that this is absolutely why Donald Trump is trying to get the Supreme Court to sign off on his federalization of National Guard troops and, really pushing the limits, quite frankly, by sending Texas into Portland or whatever today's little peccadillo is. It would be unthinkable in any other administration to contemplate the use of troops, whether they're National Guard or military, to enforce at the polls. For one thing, there's a statute that, if memory serves, prohibits that, right? You can't put that sort of capacity at the polls. knowledge is power. And understanding what the possibilities are before they actually come into being is critically important here. Remember, there was that moment at the tail end of the first Trump administration when we learned that there was a plan to send the military in to seize some of the voting machines. It didn't get very far. There were still pretty decent guardrails in place in the military. Pete Hegseth wasn't the Secretary of War at that point in time. Without guardrails, there is a possibility that we will see an effort to do this in the 2026 elections. Let's just stop with them for right now and focus on them. Trump will absolutely hold elections in 2026. I hear the fears that there won't be elections, but you know, there's nothing that a wannabe dictator likes more than clothing himself in sort of the varnish of the rule of law. That's why Putin still holds elections in Russia. He may have knocked off all of his political opponents, but if he can conduct an election and win it by putting his thumb on the scales, then he can claim to be an elected leader. And so in 2026, the stakes will be very high. I think before we get to troops on the streets, we'll see this effort to require everybody to prove that they're a citizen before they can register. You know, they've been trying with the SAVE Act, which so far has failed. Trump tried it with an executive order that the courts have blocked. Now there's a move to get one of the agencies that works on election procedure to require Americans to prove that they're citizens to register. And that's expensive. There are people who cannot afford to get a passport, which is the easiest way to prove your citizenship, and they will be effectively blocked from exercising their right to vote if, as communities, we don't stand up and find ways. Every state has its own rules for voting. We will have to find ways to make it possible for everyone to be an engaged voter, regardless of their financial means. That's going to be the biggest challenge. This threat that is being deployed, that the military will be out during elections, is exactly that. It's a threat, because there is no way more effective to keep people from voting than to get them to decide that they will sit out the process. We saw a lot of that in the last election, right? If you don't like some of the Biden administration's policies, then just stay home. That's your protest vote against Kamala Harris, and we all know how that turned out. The same thing here, making you afraid to vote. Perhaps going to communities where there's a heavy immigrant population and pulling voters who look like they might be Hispanic out of line using ICE agents. That's certainly something that people have speculated about. But the reality is that the law prohibits that, and the civil rights community in this country is as strong as it has ever been. And there will be organizations like the Inc. Fund, the Legal Defense Fund. There will be the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. There will be MALDEF, which advocates for Hispanic American voters. And those groups will be proactively looking at these situations in advance of the election and planning to litigate as soon as they are able to do it. That's something that we can count on, that the rule of law will work for us in that regard. Our job is pretty simple. Our job is to not let anything dissuade us from voting, and to make sure that we're talking with our friends and neighbors about how important it is. They would not be trying so hard to take that right away from us if they weren't terrified of what will happen if we all vote.
A couple of quick final questions, and then we'll let you all go. So I just heard about the subject of this next question in the green room, which wasn't green. And so I don't know if this is a fair question or not, Joyce, and if you've heard about this, because you're offline for 10 minutes and something new happens.
Oh, no.
So the question is, I hear Trump's latest scheme is to sue DOJ for $250 million for investigating him. Does Pam Bondi just write him checks?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the job that she's been assigned, right? This is so frickin' crazy, right?
I don't even know anything about it, and I think, yeah.
I mean, Trump thinks that he is owed something for having violated the law and been indicted. And of course, his argument is, well, I was wrongfully indicted by these deep staters at the Justice Department, and now I should be compensated to the tune of, I think it's $230 million is the ask. If Donald Trump is entitled to that, then everybody who's ever been indicted is entitled to that. And that's just not how it works. He has filed, my understanding is, an administrative claim. And sometimes people file those and the cases look so bad that the Justice Department decides we need to settle this. If this person sues, we're going to lose.
Yeah, but the party making the decision here, again, I'm speaking
Well,
out of complete ignorance.
getting there.
Yeah, okay.
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
And there's a judgment fund. I mean, there's a process, is my point here, that works. But in this situation with the President of the United States, even Donald Trump acknowledged when he talked about this that there was an implicit conflict of interest, right? I think he said, it's sort of like I'm suing myself. Well, yeah, that is sort of what it's like. This Attorney General cannot make that decision. Decisions in cases with this dollar amount have to be made at least at the Deputy Attorney General level. That would be Todd Blanche, who I think has some interest in Donald Trump. This is one of those things that we have seen far too many times to say it's crazy and it can't happen, right? Like I used to say, this is crazy, this can't happen, this will violate the rule of law. Well, this is how Donald Trump operates. This is how Donald Trump wants to profit off of the presidency at this moment. So I don't want to rule out the fact that Pam Bondi will write him a check, but I think that there are a lot of people who will make a lot of noise if she does, and I don't think it'll happen ultimately.
Okay, well, that's good news.
It's a great question.
We're rapidly approaching our time limit here. If I can make one public service announcement. We talked about where you should get your news. Joyce and I spend every Tuesday morning together. I think it's been almost 5 years now. I say, for me, 3 things are certain: death, taxes, and Tuesday morning with Joyce. It's been a real pleasure and a treat and an honor to do that with you every week.
It's wonderful.
Keeps me up on my toes. But I know that many of you here are listeners of the program. Most of it is behind a paywall. There happens to be, for this very special group who came to the 91st Street Y, a 40% off membership. I'm obligated to say these things. Go to staytuned.substack.com/92Y and check us out. You might like it. Before I let you go, Joyce, I want to congratulate you again on the book. It's incredibly important. Your voice is incredibly important, not just, by the way, on television and the podcasts, but also your newsletter is a must-read for so many people who care about the country, who have not given up. I always say, my whole shtick about not giving up is, to the extent you are fighting against the things that Donald Trump represents and the MAGA universe and some of these items that you mentioned at the end of the conversation, there was nobody in modern American life and politics who was more down in the dumps and a loser in political speak than Donald Trump. And he didn't give up. And his people didn't give up. And if he didn't give up, and his people didn't give up, then I don't know what the hell people are doing thinking about giving up, who are on the right side of history and the right side of the rule of law. So that's what keeps me going. I'm not giving up as long as that side hasn't given up. I will also say that I admire you for so many things, Joyce. Your intellect, your compassion, your open-mindedness. But as a selfish matter, what I appreciate most is our friendship. I'll always value that. We talk on the side about legal issues that we have too. So when I have an issue or a problem or something thorny that I want to deal with that is not for public consumption, Joyce is my phone call. Joyce Vance, this is no doubt going to
cry now.
No doubt going to be on the bestseller list very soon. Thank you all for coming.